in the day.
Really?
Probably 5:15.
Time? Okay. Okay. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I want to welcome the audience to this session that we're having called A Nation at Risk, a National Conversation. Want to give you a little bit of background on where we are and why we did this report to start this out and set the stage for what I hope we're going to talk about today in terms of where are we headed in this country. A couple of years ago, or actually 2.5 years ago, we did a session here in Washington, and we brought about 66 people together to talk about where are we going with early childhood. They were 8 groups of people representing different walks of life in the country. And one of the recommendations that came out of that meeting was that we update A Nation at Risk. That we should look at where we've been and sort of evaluate what has happened since that commission report was published. So what you see today, and I hope that the audience watching this will go to the website and read the report. It does update the original study. So what I want to talk about today is where do we go from here then? We know that we have made some progress, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but we also know that we haven't done enough. And it's sort of a belief here that we need to expand the table, similar to what we did in the offsite with the 66 people. We need to expand the table and create a much broader conversation in this country about early care and education. So what I'm going to do first is introduce the panel, and you'll see on the slides that we have basically the people that we've invited to have this conversation. All of them I consider very dear friends, and I also am very grateful to them for taking time out of their very busy schedules to participate in this. As you can see, our first person at the table is Sharon Lynn Kagan. She is the Virginia and Leonard Marks Professor of Early Childhood and Family Policy and co-director of the National Center for Children and Families at Teachers College, Columbia University. She's helped shape early childhood practice and policies in the United States and across this globe, actually. So welcome, Lynn.
Thank you.
The next person is a long and dear friend of mine, another one, Joan Lombardi, whom I think we all know and have come to know in many roles. Joan directs the Early Learning Opportunities, a strategic advisement service focused on the development of young children, families, and communities. And Joan, we share something with she was the very first Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Childhood Policy at HHS, a position that I had the honor of following her in a few years ago. So she's worked both extensively in government, in private, at every level of government, and also on the international scene. So thank you, Joan. The next person is a dear friend, Ralph Smith, who comes to us as the director of the campaign for grade level.
That works.
That works.
That
We can all read the bio. I love what Ralph says about himself in that he considers himself a recovering professor and could we say recovering lawyer, maybe?
That's a longer recovery,
much longer recovery. Okay. But I think, where in my background with Ralph and I think he's one of the few people that's really taken something to scale in this country, and the efforts around the grade level reading initiative and how he has worked, and we'll talk about this, how he has worked with communities to engage a broader perspective of views in the country. And then finally, my dear friend Mira Mani, Dr. Mani, thank you for coming. She is currently the director of the Children and Families and Communities program at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation in California, but comes to that with a long history at multiple levels, both in research at the state level, in the foundation community in Denver, and education in other parts of the country, and we'll get into that as we go forward. But again, brings a perspective that I think we needed to see. So let's move on. What we're going to do first is just take a very quick overview of what we did with the report and talk a little bit about sort of what brought us to this. As I said, we felt very strongly that from the group that we needed to evaluate where we've been in order to know where we're going. And so we did take the nation at risk, look at it, and then to say, okay, so what's happened since 1983? So in going to the next slide, what we found is that we're still falling short as a nation, and that's why we named the report what we did, A Nation Still at Risk. Up on the slide, you'll see that we have done little in regards to improving our SAT scores, and that our students still rank below other developed countries when it comes to international assessments, and we'll talk about that more. The nation is not providing an equal education opportunity for all of our children. I think that's very stark when you look at some of the data, that 1 in 4 children live in poverty in this country, and especially children under 3. The poverty level is highest among our children under 3. Another thing that we're looking at very seriously is really what are we doing to our young parents and our young mothers, with 1 in 4 working mothers returning to work within 2 weeks of having a baby. And I think I can't even begin to have the conversation about that. It is just really something. And that children from less affluent households obviously have measurable differences in their language development as early as 18 months. All troubling things. Then when we start to look at the inequities elsewhere, we know that learning begins at birth in this country. The original at-risk report looked at children in the public education system, basically beginning at school entry age 5 or 6. So what we're trying to suggest and what we're doing is that we know now from the research that learning really begins at birth. And that if we're going to do anything to move the nation forward in terms of a comprehensive education agenda, we need to be thinking beginning at birth and on into the public school system and even beyond. So what are we doing, and what can we do to expand our look, not just across disciplines in this country of other sectors, but also begin looking at it, sort of going up the scale and into the school system. We wanted to say and acknowledge that there have been positive things. There are reasons for optimism in this country. And when we put our mind to it, we have done some things that really do make a difference. We know that parents, all of our parents, want the best for their children. I don't think anyone in this audience or at this table would deny that. We also know that there's recently been things that actually show that early childhood programs can break the cycle of poverty. And so these are investments that we need to know. We have much stronger scientific research now than we did back in 1983. We also know that we have a broad array of stakeholders who recognize the importance of early childhood, but how engaged are they in the conversation? That's something we want to talk about. We've had success in increasing the federal investment over the last several years in early childhood, federal and state investments, and some states are doing, phenomenal things right now. And then finally, some of the examples of what has really worked for us are things like the CHIP program. If you think back to 1983, we didn't have that then. Now we have more children who are covered by health insurance. We look at the DoD and the military program, what happened there. And then our national efforts around home visiting have really paid big dividends for this country. So it's not like we don't have something positive to look at. We also, given where I work, that's a good thing to say, is that we do have broad bipartisan support for this issue in Congress and I think at all levels of government. People really understand, and there is not that divide in this area that there are in some other parts of the policy world. However, all of that said, we still have no system and no framework for moving this issue forward in this country. And that's one of the things that we want to examine today here. We know that the cost of providing high quality in these programs is high, and it's more than most of our young parents can afford. So we're going to have to begin to deal with this issue of financing and creating the framework in which we can do that. Finally, we think we lack a comprehensive strategy for this age group, and something that some of your work, or the people at this table, I think will call attention to. And then finally, we lack the public will to do what needs to be done. We have not coalesced this country around an agenda that will get us moving forward in any meaningful way. So as we have learned from looking at the nation at risk, we need a national commitment to excellence in this country. It's as urgent today as it was in 1983, if not more. And I think some of the work that you all have done on the international scale will attest to that, actually. So we believe we need to broaden that and figure out where we're going from now. So it's the final slide says on this one, the stakes are just too high. The costs of inaction are just too great to allow more and more of our children to continue to fall behind. So we need to think through where we're going, and we need a national commitment to this issue. So how do we move forward? And that's the panel that I brought together that's going to tell us how we're going to do that. So before we get started on the questions, I want to remind people in the audience that you can either share questions with us on Twitter, and there's the hashtag BPC Live, or submit them at the link below on the video. So we encourage you, if you have questions, to please send them in, and we'll try and address them. We're going to have a conversation here first, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. So let's get started with this. And again, I can't thank these people enough, because I know they all have very busy lives, and I appreciate them taking time out of their days to come here and join us. So I'm going to start on the first question, Mira, with you. And something like this: in our policy brief, we discussed the fact that the United States has not made significant gains in educational outcomes when we compare our students to those of other developed nations. The reasons vary, and the solutions are not simple. We know that. To begin, we want to start with you, but each of you to sort of reflect back on the last year since the 1983 report was issued. What are the 2 to 3 biggest lessons you think we should have learned, and what can we do how can we use those to move forward? So Mira, I'm going to ask you first.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of my esteemed friends, right? And thanks to BPC for actually updating the report. It is so important to step back and take stock of how far we've come and how far we have to go. And the 30-year window, interestingly enough, is just as long as I have been in this country. I moved to the United States in 1982 and have been in early childhood here since. So it's an interesting window for me to look back, right? I think we have a lot to be proud of, and you named all of it in your summary, which is that the neuroscience has come forward about the importance of brain development. Economists have talked about return on investment and have made the case. You've got business communities in locales that have supported bond measures, supported improved and increased investments in high quality preschool, and preschool has certainly seen some traction across the nation. You've talked about CHIP, and we've tried various approaches with relatively minimal success on how to support parents, but we've tried. And I think that clearly, and we've got bipartisan support on the issue, which is huge and important. But I think where we have a ways to go is we seem to be focused on singular solutions. And for some reason, we are either looking for the silver bullet, or we're looking for a single key lever that we think is going to pull all other levers along. So in my experience, children don't grow up in isolation from their families or their communities. And we have to think about solutions in a comprehensive way. And the frame to Jen is, I think, a really important frame for us to hold as we move forward. And every time we think about policies for children, we need to think about the impact and the supports that the adults in their lives are going to need to help move them forward. If the statistic is indeed true that so many parents go back 2 weeks after giving birth, isn't it about time that we had paid family leave, that had job guarantee, that had salary guarantee, that made it possible for low-income moms to actually stay with their children? So I think we haven't exhausted the policy solutions, but we really tend to be both linear, incremental, and very singular in the way we approach problems. And so I'd like to see us over the next, hopefully not 30 years.
Yeah.
Let's give ourselves 10.
Okay.
Really to step back and say, okay, what are a comprehensive set of solutions where we can pull multiple levers? And that's where you have to build a campaign. You have to build a campaign to build public will to support parents and children and families at the same time. And I think that's the piece we're missing. So.
Thank you. Ralph, how would you answer that? What have you seen over the last 30 years?
Well, the first thing my first answer would be I agree with everything Mira just said.
Yeah, I think
I think that today we have an opportunity and perhaps a narrow window to revisit what I think is really magical thinking, that somehow without addressing in a serious way poverty, we were going to see significant changes in the outcomes from public education. And this narrow window may not be reason for optimism as it is for hope. And the hope is that as more and more families, and not just families of color, find themselves dislocated within this economy, as more and more families find themselves having to depend on food stamps and public benefits, which they used to deride, decry, and despise, as more and more families see their grasp of the American dream not as secure as it once was, and now have a palpable fear that they're not going to be able to keep their kids out of poverty, I see an opportunity for a different conversation about poverty. And that opportunity comes at a time when we know with a certain degree of clarity and certainty what it will take to really disrupt generational poverty. There is a moment here when we can really change the conversation because there's more awareness, there's deeper understanding, there's a growing sense of urgency that's being propelled by the economic hardship that hardens into generational poverty. And the bipartisan curiosity about poverty is now significantly more evident today than it was 3 decades ago when many of us had to depend on Jack Kemp as being a sole voice. Today, there are others on both sides of the aisle who are open to the conversation and interested in pursuing solutions. And that, for me, is the reason, if not for optimism, for hope.
I think that's true, and I think back to Mira's point on the 2Gen, I think these things start to come together in that kind of a conversation. And I think here in Washington, there are people on both sides of the aisle who they are very interested in the connection between what you're talking about, the whole issue of poverty and how that impacts children. I think we have got to figure out though what we want them to do about it, and I think that's sort of a point of what we want to discuss here. Joan, let's go to you and sort of what's your reflection?
Well, first of all, Linda, thank you for your leadership and for putting such a great panel together. It's really been a journey that we've all been on together with lots of people across the country, and it's interesting to reflect back to '83. I think what you feel when you think back at my age, at our age, is how fast it went. And you know, I reread some of the parts of A Nation at Risk, the original report, and what really struck me is how far we've come from the field's perspective, that there was so little in the original report about young children.
Right.
There were a few words, but we've come a long way when you consider that you could never do a report now without, well, maybe you could, without addressing the needs of young children. You asked for lessons, and there's so many lessons that I think we could all reflect on. I think of at least three. First of all, picking up on what Ralph so eloquently said, I think what we've continued to learn throughout these years is the importance of what economists call the initial conditions of children, what child development people call the initial conditions. They matter. And so where you're born and how you're born matters to your lifelong learning, behavior, and health. And I think what we are about and what this new era is about equity and addressing that in a very frontal way. So I think that's one thing we learned. Secondly, picking up on Mira's point, it is the adults in children's lives that matter, both parents and caregivers. And I mention both because we need to enable their environments to parent and to care and to teach. And we haven't done enough of that. And I think finally, the biggest lesson for me is it's all about persistence. That policy, you and I have talked about this, Linda, policy is not made in a linear fashion. We go back and forth, we take a step forward, we take a step back, but you can't give up. And I remember many years ago writing a book on advocacy, and the core thing I wanted to share with people is you can make a difference. And I think everybody has to believe that and know that, you know, we've got a long way to go. We've come a distance, but we've got a long way to go, and don't give up.
Right. Okay. Lynn, how about you?
Like my colleagues, I want to thank you and the Bipartisan Policy Center for bringing us together and enabling us to have this conversation. And like my colleagues, I concur with everything everybody has said. Mira, I've been in this a little bit longer than 30 years, and in this country a little bit longer than 30 years, so I so respect your comments. My vistas really suggest that we should take heart. We've gotten young kids on the agenda, on the policy agenda, on the practice agenda, and actually even in common parlance. We really focused in the early days on getting programs up, just getting them up. As we moved through the decades between the 80s and now, we began to focus on quality, and I think finally we are hitting our stride and really turning that agenda to one that is more equitably focused, and so that is all good. I think in the early days, 1980s, we were less reliant on data. We kind of looked at people who produced data with a little bit of skepticism. What could they possibly know about the realities of the real world? And I think we've advanced in our appreciation for the role that data, both scientific data, case studies, numerical data, can really play in influencing policy. And I would say the last thing that we've really learned is that this idiosyncratic approach to policymaking that unfortunately characterizes our national policy strategy is really not working for us. So from my perspective, the time is now for a big rethink, not only about what we do, but really about how we go about altering our approaches to policy given all we've learned.
Okay. I think it's interesting that most of you have touched on you know, some of the big learning factors. Why is it, and I'm going to go a little bit off what we were talking about, but why is it, do you think, when we mentioned where we've had success in the home visiting program and CHIP in some of these programs, why were we able to move those as a country, and you know, we seem a little stuck in terms of the early childhood issue? What came together, for example, home visiting just happened in the last probably 7 to 8 years in this country. Congress got behind it, we put money in it, it's spurring things to happen. It does get to many of these issues about prenatal beginning at, you know, the sort of what you were saying there about the initial conditions. Why could we move those? What was different in what happened? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
You know, I don't know if you're referring to how difficult it is to move the child care agenda.
Right, I am,
But
yes.
I think that there's been an ambivalence in the country about how we feel about working women and child care that is still being discussed to this day, and that we haven't faced the reality that this is part of our everyday life now, and that it needs some type of public financing to support it, because otherwise, you know, we know that parents are paying a higher percentage of their income than they should be. And on the other hand, providers are continuing to really suffer through low wages, which is directly affecting quality. So those two things are two sides of the same coin. But I think the reason it's been so difficult is because of the long-standing ambivalence and not facing the reality of what families need today.
Anyone else think about that, Mira?
I think it's interesting that you talk about CHIP and home visiting, because with CHIP, what it really took, I think, was a national, at least from the philanthropic perspective, a national effort to build a state-to-state to federal advocacy network that was strong, that built bipartisan support, and it was a simple message, right? Insure young children. And access to health insurance is a simple measure. My apologies. I don't know how to turn this off. And so I think the clarity of the message, the simplicity of the message really helped, but also building the structure around it, which was the state to federal, and it was a unified message. I think what happens with programs and services that are a little more complex, in which it's not really about just access, but it's about the quality of what happens and achieving outcomes, the message gets really fuzzy, and you don't know what you're selling, and it's harder to build that kind of depth of consensus. And I think that's a challenge for us, and I think we should absolutely address that head on. And Lynn talked about quality becoming part of the equation now in a way that it wasn't before. And I think that is largely true, Lynn, but I also really do see at the state level advocates, when they have to make a choice, are having a hard time choosing quality over access because of the cost. And I think we've got to say access to quality if we want a set of outcomes. So we've got to, so I think it's more complicated.
Interesting. Well, I remember back to some of the, and I was thinking about you, and I was thinking about this whole idea, especially around home visiting, because the Packard Foundation invested a lot in home visiting in some of the early work that sort of looked at the impacts of home visiting and so forth. And I'm curious, and I'll move on, but I'm curious as to sort of the role you think the philanthropic community might play in this issue of early childhood, similar to what happened with home visiting, because I think there was a big push from multiple groups around this issue early on. And I'm not sure we have that same sort of broader constituency yet in early childhood.
I think the nut we haven't cracked in this country is implementation of quality at scale. And that is one that we are trying to take head on and trying to understand. And I think philanthropy can play a really important role, because what we've done historically in philanthropy is built the evidence, created models, supported public policy, and said public policy will get us to scale. And actually it doesn't.
It doesn't, yeah.
there is an implementation cycle that has to happen where you deeply engage communities, build demand for the change that you want to see, which I think really speaks to the work of the campaign that the campaign's really been working on. But you build demand ground up for it and try to support it with the data and showing that you're moving in the right direction. And I don't think we've gotten there. So I would say that that's a place that philanthropy can really play a role.
Okay.
Lynn, did you want
You want me to go or I'll go? I noticed as we all were regaling our collective success that most of it was stated in terms of a program, the home visiting program, the CHIP program. And to Mira's point about the challenge at hand, which is really going to scale with quality, it seems to me we've got to consider a different think, that our focus on policy is less about the programs and more about the infrastructure or the supports that really give those programs life. What about the governance strategies? What about how we finance these programs? What about how we monitor them? What about the data? And indeed, our national think, in comparison to other nations, has been, we're really happy if we can get a program up. We're not really concerned about scalability, about longevity, about cost efficiency. So I think our outcomes need to be tweaked a little bit so that we indeed have new gauges for our collective success, gauges that actually embrace not only a programmatic but a systemic approach to policy.
Joan, did you want to jump in on that, or did you?
No, I want to hear from Ralph.
Ralph, over to you, Ralph.
I do.
Well done. You know, Linda, in response to your question, and I've thought about this primarily because of you. I think there may be a difference between childcare and a number of the other issues. When we think of those areas where there have been really significant change, welfare reform, marriage equality, the legalization of marijuana, and a number of other areas, these are issues that are amenable to state action. And one or two states can make a decision within the state and create a natural experiment, and what we see is essentially a viral effect. And we've seen that in a number of areas. Childcare, because it is a significantly more complicated and more expensive issue, doesn't lend itself as easily to a state-based solutions. I think that, you know, and I learned this from you, that a child care system is going to need the involvement of local government, the involvement of state government, a contribution as necessary from families, and the involvement of the federal government. So it is not like home visit, and it is not like several other things which may be amenable to a programmatic
To your point,
state-based solution. And I think that we ought to look at those issues and say that in some of these issues we can build, as Mira suggests, state-by-state advocacy coalitions and find ways to adapt to the levers that are important and available in a particular state. And there's some issues around which we need to build a national consensus for policy. And that's where I have a disagreement with my good friend Lynn Keegan. I don't believe, and this is heresy coming from somebody who spent 2 decades at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, where we believe and invest in database advocacy. I don't believe data are enough. And I think we've got pretty good evidence that some policy is made on the basis of data, and a whole lot of policy is not. It's driven by values, by perceptions, by a whole series of other factors. And we need to build that consensus. We need maybe to resort to empathy. We need to be able to tell better stories.
Well, that's
And
data.
not,
That's data.
okay, if that's the data,
That's your definition.
if you're not going to reject that as the power of the anecdote,
I love
okay.
anecdotal data.
If we've got to think differently about how we approach childcare, because I think the urgency of it requires deeper thought. And stronger remedies. That's and you've really pushed me to think about this issue in a way that I hadn't thought about it before.
I do think, and I've said for many years in working in sort of the arena that we work in here in Washington, that good policy is a combination of data, good data research, and stories and models, and to some of the, so it's all of these things coming together. I think the other thing that, Ralph, you sort of bring to light is that on the surface, childcare in particular, but early childhood, because the children are short and they're cute and all that, that the issue is simple. That it's really an easy, what's so hard about childcare? And then once you start peeling back the layers and you understand how complicated it really is between the access, quality, all of these things, it gets very complicated and almost too complicated for people to get easily. And so now go to Joan.
I still come back to the country's ambivalence about working mothers. I mean, you see it still surfacing in newspaper articles just in the last few months. And, I think that we need a switch of our thinking about childcare. It's not a deficit, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to reach children. It's an opportunity to reach families, to build communities. And, and it's here to stay. And so we have to have a national campaign to make sure that it's good, because the children that are at the most at risk in that system are the children that we're the most concerned about, because their parents can't afford too often quality, don't have enough assistance to support it, and the providers are also seriously at risk. So, I think it is a complicated issue. It's a hard issue to communicate, but I think we have to get underneath the values and ambivalence. And have a national dialogue about it.
Ralph, I think one of the questions that I'd like you to talk a little bit more about is, because I do think that the campaign for grade level reading has been extremely successful in this country. I go to communities and the mayors are involved. You've got a whole bunch of people involved in that work. Can you talk a little bit more about how you did that? I mean, I know that it's taken you quite some time here and it wasn't simple. So how did you go about that?
There'll be a study written and published that will say that this was a carefully crafted plan that was
And you're the author?
brilliantly author, architect, brilliantly executed. The fact of the matter is we are as surprised as many others are by the take-up on the messages of the campaign. And so we've had to go back and really interrogate what appears to be success and ask some strong questions. And on reflection, we think that by saying up front that this was intended to disrupt generational poverty, carry just the right amount of ambition to speak to folks who know that's an issue and want an opportunity just to attach themselves to something that's willing to say it out loud. But that wasn't enough. I think we also managed to get a large number of people who wanted something that was not just aspirational, ambitious, but who wanted something that was achievable and actionable. And by saying it's achievable and important, we speak about it as early school success. And who's really against early school success? No one. And to make it actionable, you get it down to we can measure early school success by third grade reading proficiency and increasingly by third grade math. Moreover, we can ask the question of whether kids are chronically absent or not, and whether kids are experiencing some learning loss. By having it tangible, and this is where Lynn gets all her points back, but by having it tangible for people who can act and who can see increments of change and increments of time, they were able to attach to something that came at a time when we were talking, and we still are, that our politics are broken, our systems are gridlock, and we're doomed to paralysis. People in local communities want something to which they could attach and something that they could do about issues they care about. So we ended up with the right message and the right balance at the right time, have been the grateful beneficiaries of the work of the mayors who seized on it, the heads of the public libraries who seized on it, the civic leaders in communities who see the community-based organizations who saw this as an opportunity to do something about a set of issues they cared about, while simultaneously sticking a finger in the eye of poverty.
Interesting.
Well, you know, I see this community movement as part of a new era in early childhood also, that I feel like we're at the dawn of a new era. I like to think of it as early childhood 2020. It's a good metaphor because we're coming into focus. And when you look across the country at this campaign and at several other initiatives that are focused on communities, when you look at the communities themselves, from Austin, Texas to Lincoln, Nebraska, to Dayton, Ohio, to Bridgeport, Connecticut, across to Washington State and the many communities there is an excitement happening. There is an enthusiasm about coming together and getting something done. How do we make this the best place to raise a child? How do we assure grade level reading? How do we address poverty? So I'm excited about that. I don't think that alone will do it. I think, as you've pointed out many times, Linda, it's also about state action and about federal action, and they should be aligned more than they are now. So, but I am excited about the possibilities here that go beyond the gridlock that we're hearing.
So how do we take what you guys are saying here and sort of, if you will, move it up? Because I agree. I mean, I've been out there and I've seen a lot of excitement in communities and people are talking about this. My fear is we're going to miss an opportunity right now. A window is open for this issue, and are we ready to go through it? And I'm not sure we are, because I'm not sure we have a good, like Ralph, you had a good, clear message. You know, what you were, a goal with measurable outcomes and a message that resonated. And if I hear what you're saying, you brought in librarians, all kinds of different people to the table, which was one of the points I was trying to make getting us going, is that I don't think we have a broad enough table here yet. But so how do we bring all this together and help it move up and have an impact on federal policy at this point? And I think that's a challenge, and I don't want us to miss an opportunity right now.
I'll try tackling
Okay.
that. I'll try. Number one, I get concerned when we talk about this as being so overly complex. It depletes our energy and our vision. I would reframe this as, this is really doable. Other countries have done it. We have a lot that we can learn from them, and we have a lot of other campaigns and efforts that we've learned. So I would switch the conversation, the attitude. The second thing I would do is I would render some precision to the definitions. The it is very vague. Even in this table so far, we've talked about it as childcare. We've talked about it as early childhood, and a number of us are talking about the it as broad-based services to children and their families. So coming to some coherence around the it is really important. I would suggest, in picking up on what my colleagues have said, that there is an inherent value bias in this country. It's a part of our social context that refutes the importance of childcare and that refutes the importance of women and women's contributions to both families and the economy as well as to the policy agenda. Therefore, I would submit that we perhaps should be reframing our understandings, or the way we are, not our understandings, but our positioning of childcare, and think about it within the broad context of services for children. Countries that make advances don't frame it in terms of the policy solution, which is childcare. They think about it in terms of advancing the betterment of their populations and investing broadly, comprehensively. And so that I would hope that we would adopt a children's focus. This is what the United Nations has done. This is what countries around the world have done. And as Ralph says, who indeed would refute the investment in children for their betterment and for their development? I'm sure there are some, but in general.
But can I build on that, Lynn? Because I completely agree with you. And I would suggest that we do a journey map, and I would broaden from child to child and family focus. And how does the journey of a child or and parents pre-birth begin, and what do they need? What could they benefit from? And then you start to see a set of solutions. Even at this table, I feel we are talking more about childcare than we're talking about the potential of supporting healthy development through Medicaid, right? And so we've actually got policies in place, and Medicaid that has the gold standard for developmental screenings and EPSDT that we're not implementing. So I think if we shift it away from the policy focus to really what supports do we need in place for all children and families? And I think this is where equity plays a role. Who has the least opportunity to access that? And let's make sure that we create the set of supports and access to those supports, and let quality be a given. Let that be a non-negotiable through this, and let's not settle for anything less than quality.
It's interesting because I feel like that's happening, that there is a shift, and that's why I think it's kind of the dawn of a new era that is using data in the traditional sense and using anecdotes and saying, let's look at a population of children in our community and how do we assure that there's healthy births, that kids are thriving at 3, that they're eager at 5, and they're successful at 3rd grade. I think that is starting to happen more and more. Are we totally there yet? No. And I do think it's the 2-generation strategy that's helping that. What I think we need to do even more of is look at the disparities in the data and really face the inequalities that continue to exist. And I think
And
that's
Joan, what do you mean by that? Can you expand on that?
We've got children that, if you look, I mean, the census just came out with a report last week that said that the inequalities are the highest level that they've ever been since the census started tracking inequality. And you know, I think you see that where we have the data in the birth cohort of a longitudinal study. We knew that the gap started at 9 months and got bigger at 4 by income quartile. We know the data that Ralph has put on the table. We know from the readiness data. So it's pretty clear. I mean, the other day they were talking about you have 70% of people who are up to 24 years of age that in the highest income quartile, finishing college, and you've got less than 10% of that in the lowest quartile. It starts at birth and it continues. We can change that picture, but we have to be very targeted and strategic about it.
And what I would add to that we've been really missing in action on is engaging constituent voices.
Right.
We really, I think that's where the campaign has been really powerful. While I think you had a big tent, Ralph, you really let communities lead by what their most pressing issues were and where they wanted to go. And their voices were important. And I would say, I want to hear from parents. I really want to hear from providers and caregivers about what makes the most sense and what solutions are really going to work and stick. Because when you do that, and we have some experience in 3 communities in California and the work that we're doing around informal caregivers, when you actually listen, then your solutions will stick.
Mira, you open up something that I think is really important, and I wanted to sort of direct the conversation towards this issue, and I think you've all touched on it, of parents. And I say every time I have an opportunity, I think we give lip service in this country to parents, with the exception maybe of Head Start, which has done a really good job of engaging parents in the whole model. What do we do to get people to really think about, from what you laid out, what do people need when? It's got to focus around the parents and what they need for their children, not just what children need. And I worry about the parent issue. And so who has thoughts on that? How do we get to change the mindset of our own community around the whole issue of parents?
I know you've been thinking about this a lot. I know.
For a few
Yeah.
minutes.
We've had this conversation
Yes,
a lot.
there's a deep ambivalence about parents, and ambivalence sometimes is a step up from the blame and judgment that we put on parents, especially low-income parents and low-income parents of color. And underneath that, there really is a sense that some parents are not worthy of their children. That these parents have made decisions with their own lives which account for where they are and the vulnerabilities that they face. And having, quote, messed up their own lives, we really can't trust them to make good decisions for their children. So we have to substitute our judgment for the judgment of parents. And within the arena of early childhood and adolescence, that is a prevailing driver of programs and policy. And until we are able to uncover that, talk about it, and try to figure out how we could change both our belief and our behavior to the point where we're willing to enable and equip parents to have bold visions for their own children and see our role as supporting parents in achieving those visions for their children, and then creating moments when we can help them mark progress and celebrate success. Until we're able to essentially revisit, disrupt, and reassemble the systems in which we work, then you're right, we give lip service to this issue of family engagement and parent support and whatnot, but we are not enabling, equipping, empowering parents to be the brain builders for their children, to be the first child care providers for their children, to be the first case managers for the children. That panoply of roles that parents have to play when none of us are around and when the services aren't available, we so under-equip and under-prepare them for those roles, and then we blame them when
Exactly, yes.
when they fail. And what we now know about brain development, early brain development, is that that has catastrophic and enduring consequences. So really it's a kind of a self-examination of the field that is in order. And wondering and confronting each other about whether we're willing to essentially revisit those assumptions, change them, change our belief and change our behavior.
Exactly. I want to skip to Lynn, because I know that you've done some thinking about this internationally, and other countries that have engaged parents in more meaningful ways. How do they do that, and what is it that is, problematic here in the United States on this issue?
I think we can look at the question from a strategic question, what do they do? But I would step back to say, how do these other countries really think about families? And I do think we have to come to a contextual realization that we actually don't think much or think well about family, and I would use the word family as opposed to parents only, given the composition of children today in the country. But if we look at countries that are really doing well by their children, really well, there is an ethos that commits to family engagement, families making choices about when to have children. There is a commitment of supports that exudes from governments to families, and I'm picturing young parents in Finland, by their choice, taking their children to community-based centers when they're very, very young, to receiving a big, big baby box when they become pregnant, all the way right on through. So I do think that part of this is we've got to confront the ethos that really tramples our ability and our strategies to engage that. Having said that, we have to look to our own successes. We have had success in our Head Start program.
Right.
And policy engagement is a mandated part of the Head Start performance standards. So why indeed don't we generate that and evoke that as conditions of other federal funding? This gets into how we conditionalize the use of federal dollars. That we use federal dollars, we don't use them as strategically as other countries do to drive the agenda to where we want it to be. And this is one way to begin to engage. Certainly it's not the only way, but in a country that is laden with our context, it does seem that an elixir of policy strategy is possible and viable, and we've done it. Just need to extend it beyond the one program where it really does exist well.
I do think that there's a lot in that, and one of the things that when you were talking that it struck me as that I've been thinking a lot about lately is that we tend to see policy very narrowly, and I was thinking about this in some work we were doing in another area. There are a number of levers of policy that we ignore in favor of one or two in this country. And I think we look for either, a law or a regulation or something to solve this, but there are multiple levers of policy, and I think we have got to look at how we pull on more of those as we move forward, and especially when it comes to the family issue.
On the family issue, I think both points are so important, and the way you articulated, the way we're approaching parents, the way we're approaching families, we've been approaching them like they're an empty glass and we fill them up with water. Instead of saying, how can we empower you? How can we recognize that your extended family now lives 200 miles away and there's no one in your community to support you? But I do think there is a change coming, and that parents, I was recently at a U-Plan meeting, a group of organizations that are coming together that are representing parent voice across the country, parent leadership groups across the country, and they are taking hold of the issues themselves and speaking on their own behalf. And I think that's a very positive move. It's an empowering move for them, and it'll bring new ideas into the field that we never thought of.
You know, one of the things that I think, and I think back on my own, you know, personal life, and until recently I used to teach parent training classes in the county where I live. And every time you'd see a group of parents bond and come together, no matter what their socioeconomic, their backgrounds were, after they'd gone through 10 weeks of, you know, talking about their children, parent, they bonded. It happened every time. I think early childhood can play a role in helping parents.
No question.
Joan, to your point about isolation from family, we can create networks for parents that give them that support. And early childhood, you know, programs, I'm almost worried to say that word anymore, but, you know, early childhood programs can help begin to build some of that out there. And I think but again, it's another place and another way that we can begin to change that sort of thinking. I know we're getting close to out of time, and we are going to start taking questions from people who are watching across the country. So I want to try and bring this all together. And ask you all to think now, as we do move forward, what are the things that you think we need to focus on to make sure that 30 years from now, it won't be us, but somebody is sitting around a table having a conversation about what are we still at risk in 30 years? So what advice, what couple of things would you say to the audience that we really need to do to try and think forward in terms of this whole Birth to 5 strategy? Lynn, we'll start with you because Mira gets to go last this time.
Okay, great. If I could do just one thing, I would really focus on how we are financing services for very young children and their families. Because in my mind, it all boils down to the resources that we have available for quality and access. I do think that we conceive of ourselves as a Nordic country where we can go to the government consistently for more dollars, incessantly more dollars, realizing, we've just had a National Academy of Sciences report on the cost of this, realizing the incredible costs that are going to be occasioned to do this well and to do it equitably. I would suggest that we be far more inventive about how we engage the private sector, and that we think systematically. I'm not thinking about getting the private sector to buy gym curtains or, you know, to donate computers. I'm really thinking fundamentally about engaging resource development across the sectors so that we do expand our universe, our potential universe for resource allocation, because without money, we are going to be really in a deficit situation. I do want to say one thing, having just completed a very large international study. Countries spend a lot of money on young children. Per capita, they do spend in general more than we do. That's not to say that we don't indeed spend a lot. They spend it on an array of services. They do it differently. But all countries are engaging the private sector far more efficaciously than we are. And I actually include Finland, who is reversing some of its policies to do more private sector engagement because their economy too is changing. Their gas and oil revenues are down, their Nokia is down, so that there are examples all over the world, particularly in Asia, about effective ways to use the private sector to leverage funds. That would be my one thing. I've got a few others, but I'm sure my colleagues do as well.
I'll pick up on the financing because I think it is our biggest challenge. And, you know, I do think it's a public responsibility. I think there's a role for the private sector in innovation, we have a private system in the United States. It's a diverse delivery system. It's very different than what we find in other countries. But I think the National Academy report, which is now being used as a basis to do state level reports, there's a report coming out tomorrow on new ways to look at revenue generation through different types of taxes and other mechanisms called Funding Our Future. I think we've got the tools now. Now we need what I think you've been calling for, Linda, which is the public will to put that into practice. And I do think we have a country that will always have a public-private partnership approach to this, but I think the balance has to come more from the public sector at every level, at the local, state, and national level.
Ralph?
The putting a stake in the ground around early school success didn't happen by accident. It really reflected a sense that there was a point at which children could become agents and partners in their own learning and their own development. And we're not sure we have it with precision, but we think that when kids acquire a certain level of, there's a social emotional level, there's an executive function level, and then there's sort of the gateway skill of reading, you know. And so it comes around 8, 9, or 10. And I think that we were trying to say that being able to describe the destination, at least that punctuation point, was an important and still is an important aspect of moving toward a solution. And I think Joan described, here's what we would want at birth, here's what we'd want at 3, here's what we'd want at 5, and here's what we would. I think that's an important thing, because if we don't know where we're going, we're likely to get distracted into all the different programs and fall in love with the program
Exactly.
and not with the destination. So in many respects, the field needs to have some clarity and some consensus around the destination. And if depending on who you talk to, it's a 0 to 3, 0 to 5, 0 to 8. The P could mean prenatal, or it could mean preschool.
Exactly.
The 3 could mean age 3, or it could mean grade 3. The chaos in the programs reflects the chaos in the field as a whole. And I think that Joan is really right in saying we ought to lock in at what the destination looked like and back map, and then align our efforts toward achieving those ends. And if we align our efforts toward achieving those ends, we would quickly go back to Mira's point. There is no silver bullet, that we're going to have to work differently. We're going to have to construct warm handoffs, do things, do better aligning and balancing and stacking and bundling programs and interventions and whatnot. I think that we can do this, but to do this is going to mean surrendering our affection and passion for a particular program that we really like. It's going to mean dealing with the big financing issues and whatnot.
Exactly.
But I think Joan is absolutely right that we've got to get clear in those outcomes and back map from them.
Excellent. Mira.
Well, I would second everything that my colleagues have said, and I think I would build allies across sectors.
Exactly.
And I would make early childhood development the central piece of all urban and community development efforts. So if there's an urban plan going on, just like if you have 600 houses, you got to build a school.
Right.
You have to start thinking about what children and families need in that community. So it becomes baked in the way we think about the welfare and well-being. And I'm just going to cheat and take one more, which is simultaneously build public will. That really does respect parent choice. Because I think where we have gotten lopsided because we think we know what's best is that we have not respected parent choice. And I think we'd want to hear from them, have them inform us on what works.
Those are excellent. Well, it's complicated and it's a challenge, but I think this has been a really good conversation. We do have some questions that people have emailed in, and some of them take off from the first one takes off from where we just left off, and that it comes from the National Parenting Education Network, and it says that we support universal access to parenting education beginning in the prenatal period, giving parents the information they need to make good parenting decisions for their families. One of these is insurance coverage for parenting education, given the long-term health risks for those who experience. That's an interesting, experience adverse childhood experiences. What other programs or policies, we should scratch out programs, go with policies, would you recommend to assure that parents receive the information that can help them create a positive early learning environment?
Well, I mean, I'm excited about the fact that there are states looking at their Medicaid program. It is a program's funding stream, and what the potential of that is to do home visiting, to do family connects, those things that address parents. But I think the bottom line is what Ralph said about it's not just information, it's creating an enabling environment so people can parent. You've got so much stress on you right now as a parent, both from your children's needs and from your parents' needs that are growing older. And I just don't think that we're building those support systems fast enough to address those issues that people are feeling.
And I would say that, you know, there are just so many private sector folks out there, and there's a lot of innovation around meeting parents where they're at, whether it's in the laundromat or whether it's through texting. So everything doesn't have to be a policy or a program, but it could be resources that are ready at hand, easily available, and supports for what could enrich and otherwise really perhaps a boring experience of a visit to a grocery store, right? But you could have suggestions for how a parent could interact with a child in that setting. So let's really use all the resources that are available.
Anybody else? Ralph, you want to?
Whether through text messaging, we now have the technology where we can provide parents the information they need, the coaching that they might want, 24/7, 365. Available when they need it, where they need it. And we should see that as an integral part of early development for kids. And this would be a cross-sector, multifaceted effort. And I'm sure if we began to push parent coaching and parent support, whether high touch or high tech or some combination of both, we open up a whole set of possibilities for parents themselves in their own groups, in their own neighborhoods, to find each other and find the data, the information, the support they need to do a better job with and for their kids.
Lynn, do you want to say anything?
I would just say that sometimes old ideas are really not bad. And many, many decades ago, there was an effort to provide parenting education / child development as a required course within high schools.
Yes.
And I don't know what the current sentiment around that is, but I do think returning to that might be one way to make sure that it is not regarded as deficit, but rather universal in need, and would actually help our entire society.
You know, can I put a plug in for that? Because one of the things that, and I do believe child development is at the core of all of this. And when I used to do this, these parenting groups, I always started with a 30-minute overview of child development, because so often people just don't understand the development of their children, and they misunderstand that that behavior is is sort of challenging behavior or misbehavior when it's actually developmentally appropriate.
Exactly.
And I actually think if we could give everybody a course in child development, we'd be all be better off. So anyway, yes, thank you for that question. We have another one here that says, what do you believe are the most impactful ways to promote equity in early childhood in both the public and private sectors. This is a big one, and this was a really challenging issue right now for all of us. Joan, do you want to start?
Well, I mean, I think assuring equity and reflecting on the need for racial justice in the country really is a journey that everybody has to take a step forward and take. We were talking about it before the panel started, and I think the goal, we just recently had a statement in the field about equity, an equity statement. And, you know, I think the message there is this is a core part of our professional responsibility to address equity. That's what early childhood should be about. But I think it all starts with a personal journey and reflections on, you know, where your own values are and your own commitment to standing up to some of the issues that the country's facing.
Yeah. I think it embedded in all of these comments was really a focus on equity for all of us here. For me, it's a couple of different things. Early childhood has probably the most diverse workforce. And as we think about that, let's really honor it. Let's make that a profession that is valued and supported by the community at large. And let's also pay attention to the families that we are supporting and ask ourselves hard questions about what are we reinforcing in these values? How are we serving families? Are we really respecting their desires? Or are we patronizing them in some way? So I think there are questions for us to ask on the front lines as well.
Yeah.
But I am very sensitive to how we treat the workforce and really how we support this workforce.
Yeah, true. Lynn, did you want to add anything on that?
I do. I want us to be hard on ourselves and to really distinguish between equity in terms of access for all children, which I think has been on the table for a very long time. What I am optimistic about is that that definition of equity right now is being expanded, where we all are being commanded to examine our inherent biases, to examine institutional racism in ways that we have not done before. So I think we need to unpack the definition of equity and make sure that it is highly personalized and not simply institutionalized and made synonymous with, well, everybody will be included.
And the one thing that I would add to that, and I've been saying this a lot recently because this is a topic that's really out there in almost every part of our community right now, is kind of expanding what you said, Lynn. I get concerned that we are not understanding the real how are we defining the terms and the real intent of an equitable approach to this work. And I think sometimes we're confusing terms here and not really understanding sort of the substance in back of what we're doing here. I worry about that as some of these things, we tend to get buzzwordy in this whole area and it loses its meaning at some point, and I'm concerned about that. Anybody else want to add anything?
In my sense
Yeah,
is
you
that-
look like you were pondering that.
I was thinking about it. You know, equity seems to me to be a kind of a workaround all. Because all is wonderfully aspirational. It is totally useless when you get to implementation. All has never meant all. And I think I recall Paul Reville, who was former state commissioner in Massachusetts, saying, look, we're doing pretty well. This excellence agenda has done very well for half of our kids, and they can compete with anybody. But it's the second half that we've got problems. So excellence hasn't worked. And I think what we need to do is to stop the workarounds and the end around and to say we're focusing on the second half. You know, all is nice. You know, we've got to say it, but we're focusing on the second half, and we've got to figure out how we're going to build public will that will allow us and bring them to focus on the second half without having to pretend as if these policies have to cover all, because the policies won't, and every time we do that,
Right.
we dilute the resources, we confuse ourselves, and we disappoint people who really need help. We need a set of policies and strategies that focus on the second half. And that second half tends to be relatively diverse. It may be disproportionately people of color, whatnot, but it is more diverse than we would want to admit. And if we focus on the second half, I think we stand, as this is where we began, a fairly decent chance of building the public support and the political will to actually get something done.
I actually was thinking as you were saying that, Ralph, because sometimes I say to myself, all equals impossible. And I think, but we really haven't come to grips with it. And I think there's an overlap here with our conversations about targeted versus universal in so many areas of early childhood. And that's going to have to be another conversation, because we have one more question from the field, and we're running out of time here. But here's another one from the field. And it says, how do you keep childcare bipartisan in the 2020 election cycle, given the potential for polarization and whispering of socialism reminiscent of the Nixon era, which takes us right back to 1983. Anybody want to take that one on?
I think lead with choice. I think it keeps it bipartisan, to be completely honest with you. And I really genuinely believe, for me, it's not just a political calculus.
Right.
It is about respecting parent choice. And we are so ambivalent about parents in this country today. And there is, you know, some of us really believe they should stay home and raise their kids, and they have no business going back to work, and this is their job. And well, if that is the case, make it possible for them to do
Right.
that, right? Create the conditions in which, because there is not a parent out there that doesn't want to take care of their child.
Right.
So I think it is the rhetoric that we use. I think we have to be smart about when we want to get out in front of things and when we want to leave well enough alone so that we don't get in the fray of the politics.
Yeah.
Because it's really important to me that children stay bipartisan.
Yeah, it is very important.
And children, I think, will always stay bipartisan. It's when you have children and parents together that I think you're going to start to see. So parent choice, I think, is a way to keep them bipartisan.
Ralph?
Mira says, leave well enough alone. And that
She
is
said
more
two
than
things.
well enough.
Okay. Well, Joan, you work here in Washington. What's your
I
advice
do.
on this one?
You know, I think that, I think we have to look at real choice. And often the word choice doesn't really allow parents choice. They don't have equal access. They don't. And so we have to have a conversation about that word.
Yes.
And I am excited that the issue has stayed bipartisan, but it needs to be bipartisan, not just in words, but in action and in financing, and putting a real commitment to the issues that are facing, particularly the second half, the left behind children. And but I think when you get out of the town that I live in, the dialogue is more conducive to those conversations, and that's why I have such hope in this community work.
Lynn, do you want to say anything on that one? Or?
I think my colleagues have said it very well.
Okay.
I would say lead with choice and children
Yes.
together, that keeping children front and center is what is going to bring us together. In a way, choice can be, it's a powerful word, right? It could be a loaded word for some folks, but I'll go with choice for kids, choice for children.
I like that.
We have one more that I think is, we've kind of covered this, but not completely. And this one says the U.S. birth rate is the lowest it's been in 32 years,
Yes,
about
yep.
the same time period as the report we're talking about. And recent reports say that millennials are not having kids because of the cost. How can we move this country forward so people can afford to have children? I do think it gets kind of back to some of what we've already talked about, but I think it is a real big issue for young people today. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
You know, it was one of the driving factors in good policies in many of the countries that, you know, Lynn has studied. And, you know, I have children that age. And I think they are concerned about the cost. And so we have to just focus on that. If they have to spend 25 to 30% of their income on childcare, if they have to face the world that's very divisive right now, and the dialogue is not healthy for children, and they're already facing technology, which we haven't talked about very much, and how to deal with that. So we need to help them and support them.
Anybody else?
I'll take it.
Okay.
The issue of declining birth rate and of the need to propagate a country's population is not new. We saw this post-World War II. We are seeing it right now. And there are a cadre of, we call them pronatalist policies, that indeed can be implemented to induce families to have children. South Korea has the lowest birth rate on the planet right now. They have just introduced 8 months ago a pronatalist policy where they are providing comprehensive services to all 2-year-old children at parental choice. We have other countries that indeed, we are the only country without a national family leave, your point in the beginning. But there are things we can do, and you know, it may just take seriously declining birth rates, a potent threat to our national economy, to induce the kind of commitment to the issues that we indeed have been talking about. So there may be positives out of that demographic, that piece of data, Ralph.
Well, I want to
Okay.
just close this on one thing because we are out of time now. And I think the last thing, you know, I think we all agree here that we have a challenge. There's no question about that we have an opportunity. I think that we tried to make that in the report. If we think that we need a national sort of a change of will, sort of what is the one takeaway or the one recommendation to people out there at any level, whether you're at a community level, a state level, or a federal level, that can help us begin to shift public will on this issue? And I think maybe you have some thoughts, maybe it's something for another conversation, but I think we have yet to figure that out with any certainty, I think, in this country. How do we do that? Lynn, you want to start?
I would actually defer to my colleagues, but to say that I do think we've got a lot of experience in this country. We invented Madison Avenue, we invented advertising, we know how to create public will campaigns. And we should mobilize that around a campaign related to children. And again, not focus on a program, but focus on the issue of what children mean to our nation. So that would be mine, but I would.
Joan?
Well, you know, I think everyone out there has a role to play in this campaign. I don't think it's in one. It's not one organization that's going to do it. It's everybody talking about what is happening in their life and how all these issues affect them and the people around them. There's none of us that get away from being untouched by this. I'm dealing with elder care right now. Many parents are dealing with elder care and child care at the same time. So I think we have to have a national dialogue, and we have to face the fact that not everything is perfect here, and that there is this unnatural inequality that we have to address.
Most of us who are parents, next to bragging about our kids, thoroughly enjoy telling the best stories about our worst moment as parents. And if you gave us just half a chance, we would tell. And we know that the children are resilient, because if they weren't, we would have killed them, you know.
Yeah.
And as we think about our own parenting, what we know is that parenting is the most difficult job for which we are all wholly underprepared. And we messed it up as often as we got it right. And my sense is that is a reservoir of empathy upon which we need to draw to change the conversation around parents, parenting, and parent choice. And if we were able to do that, we have the potential for transformative change otherwise.
Interesting. Okay, Mira, you get the last word here.
Well, you know, I've been thinking about, as an immigrant that has been here so many years, the thing that I think distinguishes the American ethos from others is the need to have competitive advantage, the need to be the best. And I think that's being called into question. That the intellectual center is moving, there's greater international competition of ideas, and I think this is the moment to say, we've got to take the long view on this. We've got to come back to being competitive, to being the best. And here's how we do it. And so it is about children and families. And it is about the 50% of the children and families. So I would say a both-and approach.
Well, this has been a great conversation, you guys, and given me a lot to think about, and I hope our audience as well. I think hopefully this is the first step in a much longer conversation about where are we going. We've got plenty of things to think back on, but let's think forward, and how do we begin to get those, what you described earlier as, you know, where are we going? What are we trying to do here? And how do we, I loved, Mira, what you said about the sort of thinking from the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
What is it that children and families need at every stage, and then how do we begin to meet those needs rather than the program which you so eloquently put, Lynn, as the overarching thing that we're obsessed with. So I think that you've given us a lot to think about here. Hopefully we can continue this conversation. I will tell people that we are doing a series of podcasts with each of these lovely people that we'll be releasing that sort of expands on the ideas that we've covered here today. And hopefully we can continue this conversation, and we can create a public will in this nation to do something more proactive and substantial than we've done to date. And I can't say it, I don't know how to say thank you enough to you guys.
No, thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
for taking your time and sharing your thoughts with us. I think we've given this country something to think about here, so I appreciate that. So to everybody who tuned in around the country, we really appreciate your attendance at this and your attention. And let's continue the conversation. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we off?